April 1939. Flushing Meadows, Queens. The New York World's Fair opens to the public, and 17 acres of Johns-Manville Pavilion gleam under the spring sun.
What was the centerpiece exhibit at that pavilion?
A character called Asbestos Man, a muscled superhero in a fireproof suit wrestling fire itself into submission. Children lined up for photos. Brochures called asbestos the magic mineral.
And what was happening behind the scenes while Asbestos Man was posing for kids?
Vandiver Brown, chief counsel for Johns-Manville, was managing the Saranac laboratory cover-up. The studies that showed asbestos killed the workers who handled it. Those studies were being edited, suppressed, and rewritten before publication.
So the same company funding the superhero was funding the silence.
The same company, the same month, from the same boardroom.
That's the world we're walking into.
Episode 25. The Navy Comes Calling. 2 months after Asbestos Man took his bow, the United States Congress passed the Strategic Materials Act.
What was the Strategic Materials Act, and what did it authorize?
Signed June 7, 1939 by President Roosevelt, it authorized $100 million to stockpile strategic materials the country would need for a war it hadn't entered yet. Rubber, tin, chromium, asbestos.
Where was the asbestos coming from?
Chrysotile from Canada, amosite and crocidolite from South Africa. The British Empire controlled most of the global supply.
Who introduced the bill?
Senator Elbert Thomas, Democrat, Utah, a mining state. By October 1940, 20,000 short tons of asbestos, $3 million worth, had been allocated for the strategic stockpile.
Did the act include any worker safety provisions?
I went into the Congressional Record. April 27, 1939, May 11, 1939. Every page of the floor debate, every amendment offered.
And?
Zero language on worker safety, zero amendments for protective measures. Not one senator stood up and said, if we're going to mine and mill and weave this much asbestos, we should think about the men handling it.
Was that an oversight, or was the hazard not yet known?
The hazard was known. We've spent 24 episodes establishing that. The Saranac studies, the Meriwether Report, the 1935 Lanza correspondence. The hazard was documented. The act simply didn't address it.
And then a year later, the buildup got bigger.
July 19, 1940, the Two-Ocean Navy Act. $4 billion, 7 battleships, 18 aircraft carriers, 115 destroyers, 1,325,000 tons of new ships.
How much asbestos went into a single combat vessel?
Approximately 300 different asbestos-containing products, pipe insulation, boiler lagging, gaskets, bulkhead panels, electrical cloth, brake linings. A 1944 War Production Board memo described asbestos textiles as, quote, a non-substitutable component in all combat vessels.
Non-substitutable.
There was no Plan B. The fleet would be built with asbestos or it would not be built. To build that fleet, the Navy needed workers, a lot of workers.
How fast did the shipyards grow?
Brooklyn Navy Yard, October 1, 1939, 9,195 workers. January 3, 1941, the Brooklyn Daily Eagle runs a headline, Borough Navy Yard employment at peak of 20,200, more than doubled in 15 months.
And by the end of that year?
October 1941, 27,258. Nationally, June 1940, 168,000 shipyard workers. December 1941, 656,000.
Nearly 4 times the workforce in 18 months.
3.9 times. And by December 1943, 1,723,000. The largest industrial workforce America had ever assembled.
All working with asbestos.
All working with asbestos.
Did anyone inspect the conditions those workers were going into?
There's a record of one. February 4, 1938, Building 10, Brooklyn Navy Yard. Inspector William Stewart walks through with a report calls, quote, the asbestos mixing room.
What did he find?
Workers mixing magnesia and fiber for insulation work. Half-mask respirators, sleeves rolled up with bands, a pail of water nearby for dampening dust.
That sounds like they knew the dust was a problem.
They knew. Stewart noted that the exhaust fan, quote, sparked excessively and needed repair and was, quote, too small.
When was the fan replaced?
September 1941, 3.5 years later.
3.5 years.
While the workforce in that yard tripled. We'll come back. First, a word from the people who've spent their careers on this.
Danziger and Diano, a mesothelioma law firm founded in 1995, a team where everyone has skin in the game. They have been through it personally and professionally. dandell.com.
Now, there's a claim you'll see everywhere in mesothelioma litigation and veteran advocacy materials. The claim is the Navy knew about asbestos as early as 1922.
Where does that 1922 date come from?
It's traced to the U.S. Naval Medical Bulletin, Volume 16, Volume 17. The bulletins are digitized. I went and looked.
What did you find?
The tables of contents are public. I read every entry. There is no article on asbestos. There is no article on occupational dust hazards. The 1922 Navy Medical Bulletin entry on asbestos does not exist.
How does a citation like that survive for decades if the source is empty?
Every source cites another source. You follow the trail, and at the bottom, nothing. A 2011 peer-reviewed article in Inhalation Toxicology said it directly, quote, no documents from the Navy or other U.S. government agencies were identified addressing asbestos hazards from 1900 to 1929.
So that's myth one. What did the Navy actually know and when?
The first verified Navy document is from 1939. H.E. Jenkins, Medical Officer, U.S. Navy. Memo to the manager of the Boston Navy Yard. Recommends respirators and protective gloves. Says, quote, amosite should be kept sufficiently moist at all times.
So by 1939, the Navy's own medical officers were putting asbestos protection requirements in writing.
In writing. To a yard manager.
What about studies of the workers themselves?
1941. Captain Ernest Brown, Navy Medical Corps, surveys workers at the New York Navy Yard. His finding? No cases of asbestosis.
How could a survey find 0 cases when those men were working with asbestos every day?
Hold that question, because in September 1941, a separate study at the same location concluded, quote, the conditions in this shop present a very real asbestos hazard, and immediate steps should be taken to segregate the dusty processes into well-ventilated areas.
So 2 studies, same location, same year. One says no problem, one says very real hazard.
That's the Navy's record on its own desks in 1941. And then there's the study that became the Navy's public defense for the next 30 years, the Fleischer study.
What is the Fleischer study and why does it matter?
Full citation, Fleischer, Viles, Drinker, and others. 1946. A health survey of pipe covering operations in constructing naval vessels. Journal of Industrial Hygiene and Toxicology. The data was collected during the war.
How many workers did they examine?
1,074 pipe coverers. They found 3 cases of asbestosis. Each of those 3 had been a pipe coverer for more than 20 years.
And what was the paper's conclusion?
I'll read it. Quote, since only 3 workers out of the 1,074 x-rayed had asbestosis, it would appear that asbestos pipe covering of naval vessels is a relatively safe occupation.
What were the actual dust measurements those workers were breathing?
Bandsaw cutting, up to 73 million particles per cubic foot. Cement mixing, up to 84 million. Installation on board ship, up to 142 million particles per cubic foot.
What was the safe threshold at the time?
5 million particles per cubic foot.
How do you get from 142 to relatively safe?
The same paper that reported 6 to nearly 30 times the safe limit called the occupation safe.
How did a court eventually treat that conclusion?
The Fifth Circuit in Borrell v. Fiberboard called the safe occupation finding, quote, misleading. And here's why. 95% of the workers Fleischer examined had been at the trade less than 10 years.
What's the latency period for asbestosis?
10 to 25 years before it's diagnosable. Fleischer was looking for a disease in workers who hadn't been exposed long enough to develop it yet. He didn't find it, and he called the job safe.
Was the Navy involved in the publication?
The front page reads, quote, "Published by permission of the U.S. Navy. Every author was a Naval Reserve officer. The data was collected during the war. The paper couldn't reach the public without Navy clearance first."
So the study measuring dust at 28 times the safe limit in workers too young to show the disease cleared Navy review and concluded the occupation was safe.
That is the published record. Quick break.
When you have a mesothelioma diagnosis and you start asking where the exposure came from, you need a firm that has spent more than 30 years finding the documentation that proves it. Danziger and Dejano, dandel.com.
Back to 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, and a memo that began quietly and ended up in federal court records.
What happened with the September 1941 very real asbestosis hazard?
That finding went up the chain, and in the same period, Commander Charles S. Stephenson sat down at his typewriter.
Who was Stephenson?
Director of the Division of Preventive Medicine, Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, writing to the Surgeon General of the Navy, Admiral R.T. McIntyre.
What did the memo say?
"We are having a considerable amount of work done in asbestos, and from my observations, I am certain that we are not protecting the men as we should. This is a matter of official report from several of our Navy yards."
Several of our Navy yards.
Not one yard, several. Official reports, and he put it in writing to the Surgeon General.
What was the response?
There is no written response in the record.
Who was Admiral McIntyre?
Surgeon General of the Navy and personal physician to Franklin Roosevelt since 1932.
What was McIntyre's other role?
He was the president's doctor, recommended for the position on the record because of his ability to, quote, "keep a close mouth."
The Surgeon General receiving the warning about asbestos in the yards was the same man who saw FDR every day.
And the Stephenson memo records what the president thought about outside inspections. Quote, "FDR thought U.S. Public Health Service inspections at Navy yards might not be the best policy due to the fact that they might cause disturbance in the labor element."
This is Stephenson's account, not FDR's own words.
We don't have a direct FDR document. What we have, Stephenson's record of what he was told. And the outcome. The Public Health Service did not conduct systematic inspections of Navy yards during the buildup. The Navy handled it internally. A federal court later described that arrangement as, quote, "official connivance at a cover-up of the hazards of asbestos in the shipyards."
Production over protection.
December 29, 1940, 6 months before Stephenson wrote that memo, FDR delivered his 16th fireside chat. Approximately 50 million Americans, roughly 59% of the radio audience, tuned in.
What did he tell them?
"We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself."
Did he say anything about the workers who would build that arsenal?
He said American workers possess, quote, "the same human dignity and are entitled to the same security of position as the engineer or the manager or the owner."
Security of position.
Not security of health, security of position. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor.
How quickly did the workforce respond?
By December 1943, 1,723,000 shipyard workers, the largest industrial workforce America had ever assembled.
What did those workers know when they walked into the yards?
They knew there was a war. They knew their country needed ships. They knew the work paid. What they didn't know, that Commander Stephenson had written, "We are not protecting the men as we should." They didn't know the Surgeon General who received that memo was also the man who saw the president daily. They didn't know the one published study measuring the dust in the compartments where they worked needed Navy clearance to see print.
They knew they were answering the call.
And they walked into the dust. One more break.
ICOM served on the USS Kearsarge and the USS John A. Bowl, boiler tender, the most dangerous job on a Navy ship for asbestos exposure. When he was diagnosed, his doctor said it might go away.
Cancer doesn't go away.
ICOM found specialist became the first VA patient to receive a cutting-edge treatment protocol, walked into surgery saying,
"It's a beautiful day."
8 years later, he's still here. His story, and others like it, are in a book called Beating the Odds. Dave Foster, Executive Director of Patient Advocacy at Danziger and Dayano, compiled stories from survivors who defied the statistics.
It's on Amazon, but if you or someone you love is facing a mesothelioma diagnosis, call Dave directly. He'll send you a copy for free.
Nearly 30% of mesothelioma cases are veterans.
Why is that number so high?
Because of everything we just walked through. 300 mandated products per vessel, a broken exhaust fan that took 3.5 years to replace, a surgeon general chosen for his ability to keep a closed mouth.
If that's your family story, Larry Gates can help. His own father died of mesothelioma after years at the Shell refinery in Pasadena, Texas.
Dandel.com. That's DANDELL.com.
Next time on Asbestos, a conspiracy 4,500 years in the making, we go inside the yards.
The dust so thick you couldn't see across the compartment.
The heat so intense, men stripped to their waists. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week.
We'll hear from the workers themselves, what they saw, what they breathed, what they were never told.
Episode 26, The Dust They Couldn't See Through.
That's next time.
I keep thinking about Stevenson. At his desk.
The man, not the memo.
March 11th, 1941. Director of Preventative Medicine, not a field posting, a desk in Washington. And he types, "I am certain that we are not protecting the men as we should." He knows exactly what he knows. He writes it down, he sends it up the chain.
To McIntyre, who was hired for his ability to keep a closed mouth.
That is the credential on record.
Closed mouth. That's what you want in the man about to receive a memo saying the men aren't being protected.
And they wrote it in the file without embarrassment, because they didn't think anyone would ever see the file.
And they were right for 30 years.
The Fleischer thing gets me differently. Naval Reserve officers, writing about conditions they're supposed to oversee, and their paper can't reach the public without Navy clearance first.
Published by permission of the U.S. Navy, they needed approval from the institution they were studying to release their own findings.
And the approved conclusion was relatively safe. Next week, we're in the yards.
Good, they've been statistics long enough.